why does there have to be some sort of ridiculous director's cut of every Zack Snyder movie? Hi, my name is Nathan. I talk about a bunch of movies on this channel. If you're new here, down below in the comment section, share what you thought of Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Share what you think of Zack Snyder as a director in general as well. I would love to hear all that. Click the like button and be sure to subscribe because it really does help a lot. I'm a bit late to watching this movie. I watched it for the first time a couple days ago. And now I'm here to talk about Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Let's just get started talking about the good. And what I think this movie, what stands out in this movie is the Zack Snyder visuals. When it goes to all the slow-mo, this visual effects and everything. All these epic sci-fi-ish shots of action sequences, a montage of people farming in slow motion. All of Zack Snyder's directorial flair is entirely there. From there, let's move on to the bad. And we got a lot to talk about in the bad section when it comes to this movie. What this movie just made very, very clear to me is that this story did not at all need to be split up into two movies. Certainly it didn't. And we'll get into more of that later on in the bad section, but that's what essentially watching this movie made very clear to me. It is a story that we've kind of seen before, and we've seen it done in better fashions and in shorter runtimes. And this movie, this story, this did not need to be 2 hours length. And, well, like I said, we'll get into more of that later. Right now, let's just talk about what I think didn't work about this movie. And what I said of it being derivative, and it feels familiar, and we've seen better versions of this, is essentially, if you don't know the backstory to both of these movies, Zack Snyder pitched it over to Lucasfilm as a Star Wars project, and they turned it down. And after watching the trailer for Rebel Moon Part 1, I was digging the vibe, and then I just saw Rebel Moon Part 1 when it came out like months ago, and I wasn't particularly crazy about it. And this movie, I think especially, it just, for me, it's much worse than Part 1, which I already wasn't particularly a big, gigantic fan of. And it's much worse because I could really feel it being derivative in this movie, more so than in the first one. I think the first one has the advantage of being that sort of first experience, so there's kind of something new to experience with it. This one, all of that novelty is kind of gone in the second film, and it's derivative of Star Wars, which is no surprise here because he pitched it as a Star Wars movie. So it's kind of derivative of Star Wars, but also takes the plot of A Bug's Life and plops the second half into this movie. And A Bug's Life does not have that big of a plot, and so this movie, naturally, doesn't have that big of a plot. And when I said this story didn't need to be spread out into two separate movies, it really didn't. Barely anything happens in the first 45 minutes of this movie. This movie's like 2 hours long. Barely anything happens in the first 40 minutes of it. It's like them returning to a planet, and then you get farming montages, training montages, dinners, talks, all this stuff that you don't really care about. And the last 80 minutes are CGI noise of a CGI final battle, and not good CGI noise either. Because it's just 80 minutes of non-stop action. Normally, I'm a big action person. I should be a big fan of that. But I didn't care about the characters. I didn't care about the story. And it just felt so derivative. I knew exactly where things were heading. And it's just that. It has so much of Zack Snyder's style. Shots are choreographed in the way that Snyder does it, with the slow-mo and everything like that. But the action is just things that I didn't really... We just had a series of things I didn't really care for. And some of it's even kind of odd. That in the middle of all the carnage that's happening in the action sequences, there's a sequence where one of the characters is fighting off like 10 other guys in a room full of like 100 people in the background, and the 100 people in the background don't do anything about it. They just kind of stand there and watch, and they don't help at all. And there's just things like that that bothered me about the movie. And none of the characters are interesting at all. They are very bland, and they don't really have any sort of personality to them that I could fully decipher or describe in this video. You don't care about the story because it's, like I said, it's something we've seen before a billion other times in a bunch of other movies, and we've seen done a lot better. What Zack Snyder goes for with the second part of Rebel Moon is he tries to have emotion and like these gut-wrenching moments where you're supposed to feel the danger of what's happening, feel the victories when they do happen, and this movie is not nearly as emotional as I think he was intending. And I think maybe the biggest element that plays into that is because you don't care about the characters and you don't care about the story, and all of it just goes back to that fact. The whole movie is kind of like that. It's just a series of stuff happening where it's comprehensible, but it's just, this is kind of like Star Wars at its weakest. This is the weakest element of Star Wars because it's just boring. It's not the action sequences are like entertaining either. They're boring because the characters are boring, because the story is boring. And it's not like a so bad it's good movie or anything like that. And what just pushes this one so far back for me is that not only does it take all the elements that didn't work about the first film and they continue it on to this film, but it adds on being cheesy and kind of cringy at times, I will admit. I know that's such a kiddish thing to say, but it's true when it applies to this movie. There's this romance going on between two of the characters in the movie that I just thought kind of came out of nowhere, and didn't fit the movie that it was in. It was so cringy, so cheesy. The lines of dialogue said, like, there's a sequence where children in the movie give gifts of like blankets to our main team of characters, and it's lines like, "You're the heart of the team, so you see we put a heart on your blanket." It's kind of like that, and I think that's what pushes it so far beneath, is that it makes it so much more unwatchable, so much cheesier to watch, so much more like, that feels weird watching. And Zack Snyder just had this very bizarre thing happen with him and Netflix somehow, where like he puts out these PG-13 cuts of a movie, and then he says there's an R-rated director's cut that's like set in an entirely different universe. He says it's very different from the PG-13 cuts. It's not a version of the PG-13 cuts. It's a whole different thing. And those look like the movies that we were excited for Snyder. Those are the movies that they sound like they were the real movies we wanted, but instead we just got these things as replacements. And so, especially part 2, I thought it just wasn't good, and I don't recommend it. Overall, I'll give it a D. But, hey, that's just my take on Rebel Moon Part 2, the PG-13 cut. Down below in the comment section, share what you thought of Rebel Moon 2, the Scargiver, over on my channel. I have more content like this. Check those out right now. Click the like button and be sure to subscribe. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to the end. I will see you in the next one.